But I'm gonna save that for the, yeah, I'll say that for the interview.
Okay, all right. So for clarification, because I feel like I saw both numbers somewhere in our correspondence. We're talking today for 30 minutes or for an hour?
30.
30. Okay, very well.
Is it 7?
And thank you for sending those screenshots to me. I that's like my favorite part of having the book in the world, is like seeing people's discussion around it.
It was every morning. So, and that's one of the ways we help, like, promote our authors, like showing interest in it and making people want to read it, to just make this ordeal fun again. And now they're like, oh my God, I gotta get it, I gotta read it, I gotta read it. I'm like, that's what we want to do.
Yeah.
I just don't want to, because I feel like it's gonna be a really good discussion, and then so I just was gonna wait till 7, then we can open it, right?
Sure.
So just it's a clarification. Me and Rebecca both have questions that we both came up with after we read. The powerful thing I think about it is the fact that Rebecca has her own different questions coming from a book, and I think that's going to be really good to like bring everybody together. So we'll ask your question back to back, and then at the end, you wrote a poem. We were thinking like, I don't know if it was a poem or not, I took it as a poem.
Yeah.
Black and, right? So I was wondering, like, at the end, like, if you could read that.
I'd love to.
Yes. And that's the only thing. Yeah, that.
Yeah, that sounds perfect. Sometimes I read a little excerpt at the beginning. Do you want to do that or no?
I don't know, because is it in your introduction?
It's in the first chapter. I can tell you what the excerpt that I like to read some, and I'm okay if you don't want to use the time in that way. I won't be, I defer to you guys, but I will tell you what the section is. It's page,
I'm curious just to see if I got anything annotated by it.
It starts on page 17. My grandmother was one of my first examples of a strong Black woman.
You know what? Can you read it when I ask you this specific question that I think it could tie into?
Sure, that's fine.
Already, yeah. Okay. You ready? Hey, you guys. My name is Aisha Malone. I am the owner and co-founder of Rose Café. Rose Café is a reading cafe that we're bringing to the south side of Chicago, more specifically the Roseland community. Roseland community is a book desert. We lack a lot of resources, but one resource that me and Rebecca thought that we could come and give to the community was the access to literacy. We want to have this vision of high-level conversation, access to books right in the center of where a lot of things are going on so that it could be active. We've done a lot of things in the community, and I was thinking, like, Rebecca, you want to talk a little bit about those things?
Yes, hi, my name's Rebecca Silverman. I'm sorry, the dog I don't know what he's doing back here, but I'm the co-founder and creative director at Rose Café. And like Aisha said, a lot of what we do is involving the community. So the Roseland community is a book desert. So what we want to do is increase literacy access. And one way that we've done that is by giving out free books to the neighborhood. Since last June, we've given out 8,000 books, and they're not just any books. They are intentionally picked books that are representative of people in the neighborhood. So that's something that we're very proud of. And another thing we do every month is a book club. And when we're lucky, we get to have the author come to our book club. So tonight we're very excited to introduce Dr. Inger Burnett-Zeigler. If you could introduce yourself.
Hi, thank you to you both for having me. I'm so delighted to be in this conversation this evening. I really appreciate the work that you're doing, particularly as a born and bred South Sider from the Chatham neighborhood. So I know it's so important what you guys are doing. But my name is Inger. I'm a clinical psychologist and associate professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at Northwestern. I am also a writer of my new book, Nobody Knows the Trouble I've Seen, The Emotional Lives of Black Women. I write frequently about mental health in the Black community, trauma, stress, and the ways that all of the social and environmental things that are happening in the world can impact mental health of Black folks. And I am delighted to get into it with you guys tonight.
So, well, I wanted to, before we begin, like I am a teacher. I didn't mention that. So like, I really, I kind of dissected the book, and then as I was reading it, I was paying attention to the title and the sub chapters, and most of the titles, you knew exactly after you read it. Okay, I know why she named it this. But there was a chapter in particular that I wanted you to kind of talk about, which was chapter 2. And it was, I'm sorry.
On My Last Nerve.
On My Last Nerve. And I couldn't make the connection.
Okay.
So I was wondering.
That's an easy one for me. I thought you were going to ask me a hard one.
Okay, yeah, let me know.
So, a euphemism in our community is they getting on my last nerve, right? And when we say that, we're talking about somebody that's stressing us out, making us angry, irritable, whatever the case may be. So when I named this chapter On My Last Nerve, I wanted to talk about all of the things that cause stress to Black women. So I talk about work stress, I talk about financial stress, I talk about caregiver stress, and the impact that has on our mental health and on our physical health, and how we can approach coping with this stress in a healthy way. So On My Last Nerve really just represents all those things that can be stressful in the lives of Black women or get on our last nerves.
Another thing that I noticed as I was reading was how you transition from talking about friends to some famous people to yourself. I guess it's a two-parter. Like, one, how did you decide who to include? And then, was it difficult to talk about yourself and include that?
Yeah, so I'll start by saying, it was important to me to incorporate stories of everyday people. I am a psychologist, I am a practicing psychologist, so I see people for therapy in my clinical practice. But one thing that I know for sure is that the people that come into therapy are struggling with the same things that our friends are struggling with, our family members are struggling with, the people that we're passing by every day are struggling with. And so I wanted to represent these common struggles that can so often feel isolating because people feel like they're the only ones. And I wanted to show it in myself because I felt like I had to have a dog in the fight. I couldn't talk about, everyone else without challenging myself to do the same. I had friends, as you mentioned, that were gracious enough to allow me to tell their stories. And then I wanted to, offer the clinical perspective, because that clinical perspective, I do hope to be informative in terms of helping people to see what therapy is like, see what some of the tools that can be learned in therapy might look like, and be able to at least just start to think about that for themselves. The second part you asked me, was it hard? It was very hard. It was probably the most challenging part of the book. I'm an academic, I'm a Black woman, I am susceptible to many of the fears that other Black women or other people have about being vulnerable and what might come along with that. And so it for sure, somebody asked me what the hardest part was about the process just recently, and being vulnerable for sure is what I would say. I
do think though that it added to the book a lot, including that.
Yeah, thank you.
The hard part was worth it, I think.
And I want to add that, none of the scary things that I imagined happened. So, I talk a lot about fear in the book and kind of imagining like these worst case scenarios. And so I had that, I had, what are my coworkers going to think? Or, fears about people feeling, I wanted very much to represent people's story in a way that felt true to them and also balanced. So I was worried about getting it right, and so by the grace of God, none of the bad thoughts that I had in my mind came to be. So I'm really grateful for that.
And so you mentioned vulnerability. That was actually one of my questions. And it also want to ask you about some of the things that you did mention. But when you said that on 89, that resistance to vulnerability has kept strong Black women from being able to rest in support, what did you mean by that? And what did you want us to like gain from that when you told us that?
Yeah, well, we keep our pain to ourselves. No one can help us. We don't have the privilege of knowing we're not alone. That sense of warmth that can come when someone else says, I've been through that too, that shared experience. When we don't share and say, I need help. Can you watch my kids? Can you go for a walk for me? I've been isolated in my house. Can you just talk? Can we listen? That holds us back from being able to rest in that support, rest in that community, rest in sisterhood, understanding, being seen, being heard. And so often we just want to keep our pain to ourselves because we're ashamed. People are ashamed. They feel like they're the only ones going through. Other people won't understand. And I think it's because everybody's walking around pretending, or so many people are walking around pretending. So when you look around and see everyone else pretending like they're not hurting, like they're in pain, and you know how you feel on the inside, it feels like you're the only one. And so what I really wanted this book to be was an invitation to everybody to shed that the idea that you have to do that, to recognize the commonality in many of these experiences, whatever it may be, whether it's work stress, whether it's childhood trauma, whether it's relationship trauma, whether it's, parental abandonment, whatever it is, shed the shame that goes with that and allow ourselves to receive the support that's often available.
So going along with that support, and the pain, the vulnerability you're talking about, I thought it was interesting when in the book, while you were in school, you talked about going to therapy yourself and that you were very hesitant to do that.
Imagine that, a psychology student that has all this conflict about going to therapy, but yes.
Right. No, so I guess it's not a specific question, but I was wondering if you could talk us through that.
Yeah, it was important to me that I include that because, I was a psychology student. I believed in therapy. I'm learning how to be a therapist. I'm at that time, even then, really passionate about mental health in the Black community. And I still felt that resistance. In the book, I talk a lot about, the things that get in the way. I was just talking with you guys about the things that get in the way of people getting the help that they need, be it that formal mental health treatment or just the support of our friends and family. And, I experienced a lot of the things that many other people experience. It was painful to think about the things that hurt me. I wanted to just not think about it. I was learning about therapy, but I still had a lot of questions about what that experience was going to feel like for me. But I was curious and I was desperate, to be honest. I saw myself spiraling and I was desperate for help. And so that's what ultimately drove me in.
Because I gotta ask you about the grandma thing. And because the grandmas that your characters have, they are rooted in things that make them want to like you guys to like thrive. So one of you guys had like a rich grandma here, take this $20. You got it from your rich
That was me.
grandma. You know, those grandmas are like my grandmas, right?
Yeah.
But then we're in a different time, sort of. And so
Yeah.
like now my mom is one of those grandmas, but she's totally different than like my great grandma. And I'm wondering like if you see the change in like the foundation of what grandmothers gave you to what they have now, and is that going to, do you see it being a problem, not a problem, but do you see there's going to be a different trend of strong Black women considering they have different type of grandmas?
You know, what I will say about grandma is that, as you point out, in many of the people that I share their stories in the book, grandma surfaced in some way or another. That was a theme that kind of came to light even as I was writing the book. I always knew that I was going to include my grandmother because, you know, she was my first example of a strong Black woman, had a really critical role in my upbringing. But as I started to like dig into the stories of others, grandma kept coming up time and time again. And grandma came up in ways that were similar and different. So the similar ways is this strength, this being a pillar, this being a person that you can turn to. Having unacknowledged trauma. There's about at least 3, maybe 4 examples of grandma having this unacknowledged trauma. But also passing on experiencing mental illness. There's a grandma in the book that, you know, has experienced their own mental illness. There's a couple grandmas that have had their direct experience with domestic violence. And so when we think about those themes, whether it's the grandma that's giving the $20 or not, I think that those themes are persisting in Black women. I think Black women are still the pillars of their family. I think Black women are still kind of putting their arms around their kids and everybody else's kids and the neighborhood kids to take care, and doing that in a way that often means that they're not taking care of themselves. And so I think it might look a little different now, but I think those general themes are still there.
Did you want to read the excerpt when you talked about your grandmother? Sure,
I'd love to. Along these lines. So this is from chapter 1, in the section labeled Strength, the chapter called I Am a Strong Black Woman. My grandmother was one of my first examples of a strong Black woman. She left her man in Montgomery, Alabama in 1951 and headed north as a single mother along with millions of other Black people during the second wave of the Great Migration, in pursuit of better employment opportunities and perhaps also a new suitor. At that time, fewer than 20% of Black families had a female head of household with no husband present. When she arrived in Chicago in 1954, after making a pit stop in Pennsylvania, she and my mother lived in a 1-bedroom apartment on the West Side in the Jane Addams homes. The public housing complex was initially built for impoverished Italian, Russian Jewish residents. They moved out of the neighborhood as Black families were beginning to trickle in, along with several notorious street gangs. Despite the welfare laws that prohibited grandma from working, she held a job as a seamstress. She made curtains during the day and attended Crane Junior College at night. Assured that her fate would ultimately turn, she rolled the dice on herself and played her numbers in the policy game, the underground lottery in the neighborhood. Her sisters, who remained in their distressed marriages, sent money to help fill in the financial gaps of the husband she'd left behind. But my grandmother's thorny temperament ensured that they remained on the outskirts of her and my mother's lives and kept them isolated and without the emotional support that they didn't know they needed. Grandma never rested in good enough. With every accomplishment, the lust for the sufficiency of validation dwindled only slightly. For more than 30 years, she worked as an unemployment counselor at the State of Illinois Department of Labor. When I went to work with her as a little girl, I imagined that I too had an important job helping people, answering the phone, and writing memos that would ultimately change the course of someone's life. The constant flow of other people not having enough kept my grandmother moving forward. She quietly repaid her debts to the system that had helped to claw her way out of poverty. Yet she could never afford to let down her defenses. Eventually, when she was more than 50 years old, Grandma moved out of public housing and returned to school through a program offered by her employer to earn her bachelor's degree at Roosevelt University. At that time, only 8% of Black women in the United States had a college education. In the early 1970s, when predatory lending, redlining, and restrictive covenants were rampant in Chicago, she purchased a ranch house facing the train tracks in the previously Dutch community of Roseland. Shout out to Roseland. White flight was at its peak as Black folks rapidly began to occupy the neighborhood. With every visit I made to Grandma's house, she planted the seeds of my self-worth and willed to me her expectations for greatness. They were steeped in the Lipton's lemon tea that we sweetened with packs of Equal and sipped out of pink porcelain teacups. We drank and held our pinkies out while speaking in fake British accents. She and I sat in perfect manner in her ornate wooden dining room chairs, which swallowed my petite frame and left my feet dangling beneath the table. As we delicately placed the teacups down on the saucers, we pursed our lips together and fluttered our eyelids, mimicking the air that we imagined rich and important people had. Be still and stop kicking, Grandma said, teaching me how to be proper and dignified. Grandma's hope for me was interlaced between her fingers as she kneeled down on the floor with me next to the bed as I said my prayers. Now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep. And if I die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take, being sure to ask God to bless Grandma, Mommy, and Daddy. In the morning, she sent me home with a promise for prosperity, folded in greeting cards that held Our Daily Bread devotional booklet and 20 crisp dollar bills that she slid to me behind my mother's back. A third for you, a third for tithes, and a third for your piggy bank. And one day you'll be rich like Grandma, she said.
Why is that section important for you to read out loud? Why did you choose that section?
I choose that section because this book is centered on the strong Black woman. And in that, I wanted to show and highlight and honor all of the things that we love about strong Black women, their resilience, their ability to overcome, their steadfastness, their spirituality. And I try and paint a picture of that in my grandmother. But there are also all of these aspects of the strong Black women that we don't talk about, which I go on to talk about later. Her relationship with her husband, whom she left, the pregnancy trauma, the, verbal abuse, those types of things that are more often than not present in these women that we revere. And I think it's so important that we talk about both sides. And I think that that's becoming a more common part of conversations for people. And so this is kind of my introduction to the strong Black women that we love. And then later we'll kind of get into more of what lies beneath.
It's interesting when you were reading that, something that stuck out to me is that, yes, she could never afford to let down her defenses. Mm. Is at any point can we, right? Like we go through this, is there ever a point that we can let down our defenses?
Yeah, that's a hard question, I have to admit. I will say being on guard, being suspicious, looking over our shoulder is a trauma response, right? That is technically a symptom that can come from people who have experienced trauma. In coping with trauma, part of the work is teaching people where they feel safe and teaching people where that trauma response is sometimes triggered too quickly, right? So you feel threatened, you feel unsafe in situations when you're actually safe. But the thing of it is we know that as Black women, as Black people, that there are a lot of threats, right? There's violence, there's racism, there's microaggressions. We live in a society where a good proportion of this fear is real. And I'm very hesitant to kind of discount that fear that a lot of people are coping with and existing with, and maybe trying to think about finding a little bit of a balance, a little bit of space where we know we can feel safe, where we talked about ease earlier. We know we can find that place of ease, but still protect ourselves in a healthy way.
Mm-hmm.
I know that's a non-answer,
but it's all just thought-provoking, right?
Yeah.
Another thing I noticed is that you switch back and forth from talking about women in general and then specifically Black women. And I just wondered how you made those decisions, because, as a white woman, there were a lot of things that I related to just because I was a woman. And obviously things that I did not relate to. So I guess I wondered, like how you straddled that between women in general and then specifically Black women.
Yeah, this is a book that I wanted to speak first to Black women, but also acknowledging that there would be a lot of relatedness, not only to women in general, people who have experienced trauma, other mental health professionals, people that love women and Black women, and just people in your world. And I wanted the book to prompt a different way of understanding the different life experiences that our loved ones may have been through. In terms of straddling between talking about women generally and Black women, a lot of women have experienced trauma, as you mentioned, but we know that Black women disproportionately experience trauma. We know that Black women disproportionately experience childhood abuse and neglect, and disproportionately experience intimate partner violence, and are more likely to die as a result of intimate partner violence, and are more likely to have, these negative pregnancy outcomes. So there's like the whole, and then our risk factors are heightened on top of that. And so I wanted to put the experience of Black women into this larger context. And so I thought it was important to frame it in that way.
And before we read it, Aisha and I were talking about, but before we had read it, I was saying, I wonder who we should push this book to. I wonder, is this a book specifically for Black women to read to learn more about themselves? Or is it a book, for everyone to learn more about Black women? And we kind of decided that it's both, like you were saying.
That's what I was going to say. So thank you for saying that. Yeah.
And the related.
And if I may, I would add, I agree with the both. And I would also add people in the helping professions. Mm-hmm. So teachers, social workers, psychologists, caseworkers that are touching many of the people that I speak about frequently, I would say is kind of a additional target group as well.
I had, when I met Rebecca, after I read the part, when you introduced some of the trauma that Kim Fox had endured, I immediately went to, because, because of some of the things that she's been doing recently, we have our idea about a person, right? And I was saying whatever I was saying. But then when I read about her situation and what she's gone through, it made me be like, oh, chill a little bit. She has some things going on in her life for whatever reason. And that helps us have a better relationship with people, right? Because now that I understand some of the things that she went through, the compassion is there, right? The empathy is there. And right. I was telling her, white, non-Black women, they might need to read it and see, because it could take off some of what they think, so that compassion is allowed in those relationships as well. So we can form unity.
Yes. Yes,
You,
I love how you said that kind of understanding someone's story, their background creates room for compassion and empathy. Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
well, thank you for writing it.
Thank you. Thank you.
So before we end, we did want you to read this poem that you wrote at the end of the book.
Yes. In moments of doubt, uncertainty, as we think about how to be anew strong, I offer this affirmation. I am a strong Black woman. My past struggles do not define me. The future is mine to take hold of. I release myself of guilt, regret, shame, fear, and worry. I have known suffering, but I have the capacity to heal. I surrender to my innermost divine power and affirmatively claim my truth, holding all parts of myself in loving kindness, compassion, and peace, always knowing I am enough just as I am.
Well, Inger, we want to thank you for writing this book. It was at a perfect time, you know, especially where it seems like, you know, writing and authors is in our culture is just getting more popular right now. It's like books after books and
By
authors.
Black women, it's like on fire right now.
Like what? And it's just like, oh, and now we have this. So I did want to ask you, do you consider this a self-help?
You know, kinda.
That's what I was saying because I've never read one. And I kind of like stay back from them. I told Rebecca,
Yeah.
this is a book like
Puts
this.
your toe in the self-help, but then brings it back.
It's a toe. It's a toe. I mean, my intention was to tell stories that were relatable and drop some nuggets that could be helpful in the process. And so the nuggets maybe are in the self-help category. But yeah.
We definitely look forward to recommending this book to everyone. We've been selling a lot of these that people are really excited about this book. So we really thank you for writing it.
Thank you. Thank you to you both.
And do we have any questions, Rebecca, before we end it?
We didn't get any in the chat.
Okay. Well, so typically what we do is we post this and all of the rest of our videos on YouTube. We're going to send you a shirt.
I love that.
Yep, and just because you was thank you for throwing in that part of your grandma moving the Rose. I'm like, okay, good. So she know what we're working with over here. And I'm excited about whatever you have coming up. Are you writing anything after this?
I'm gonna put a book on a pause. I write op-eds often just about my thoughts about how mental health issues are showing up in the world. So I'll continue to be doing that type of writing. And when the next book hits me, then, you know, I'll let you know.
Well, thank you for taking the time out tonight to talk with us.
Sounds good. Take care to you both.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.